We have an announcement finally on whether cell phones cause cancer. It's something that could affect all of us and our children. Scientists from the World Health Organization have been reviewing studies for the last week or so. I want to bring in our senior medical correspondent, Elizabeth Cohen, who joins us live with the findings. Essentially, what did they find?
The World Health Organization says that the radiation from mobile devices like cell phones is a possible carcinogen to humans. This is a very big deal because you and I have done segments about this before. Sure. It has gone back and forth. And this is really the first time that a large group, and it doesn't get any more sort of prestigious in many ways than the WHO, to say that it's a possible carcinogen. It puts it in the company of several other kinds of things. And so I want to tell you what it is, and I think that might give people an idea of what we're talking about. It puts it in the company of things like lead is also a possible carcinogen, according to the WHO, as well as engine exhaust and chloroform. So that sort of gives you an idea of the kind of risk that we're talking about.
The World Health Organization now says there's a possibility, a potential risk. Radiation from cell phones could cause cancer.
Turns out participants in the study who used a cell phone for 10 years or more had doubled the rate of brain glioma, a type of tumor. And keep in mind, cell phone use in the United States has only been popular for around 15 years.
After several minutes, that it really starts causing DNA problems. It even heats the brain.
What microwave radiation does, in the most simplistic term, is very similar to what happens to your food. You put your food in a microwave oven. It's essentially cooking the brain.
If you've ever put a cell phone to your ear, you should listen to what neurosurgeon Dr. Keith Black has to say.
There's no way to say that cell phone use is safe. I think that the public has a right to know that there could be a potential risk. Environmental factors take decades to see their effect, not a few years.
So if it may take decades to get a clearer answer, what can we say about cell phone safety now?
All right, now tonight's top story, your lifeline to the world is being linked to cancer.
This is the story that we have been talking about all day. Should we really be concerned about using our cell phones? Stephanie, what do you have to say?
Well, Cherie, Jack, we've all wondered if our cell phones are passing radiation through our bodies. And tonight, the doctors we talked to confirm there's enough evidence.
This is well recognized now as a possible risk to cancer. So the most vulnerable age group are going to be children, and more kids are using these cell phones.
Tu showed us his computer model, which shows us how much radio frequency children can absorb. It's enough for Tu to realize consumers should be alerted and aware.
In children, their skull is thinner, their scalp is thinner, so the microwave radiation can penetrate deeper into the brain of children and young adults. And their cells are dividing at a much faster rate, so the impact of the microwave radiation can be much larger.
And here's something else that might surprise you. The cell manufacturers themselves actually advise against putting the cell phone right next to your head or really anywhere in your body. Dr. Keith Black has been talking about this longer than many, but the voices joining him are becoming louder and more prominent. The city of San Francisco pushed for radiation warning labels on cell phones. The head of a prominent cancer research institute sent a memo to all employees urging them to limit cell phone use because of possible risk of cancer. And the European Environmental Agency has pushed for more studies, saying cell phones could be as big a public health risk as smoking, asbestos, and leaded gasoline.
More than 2/3 of Americans have cell phones, but there's long been a question: does heavy cell phone use hurt human health? Lindsay Davis reports on a major new study which for the first time shows cell phones do seem to have some mysterious effect on the brain.
Some are calling the study a landmark event in our understanding of how cell phones affect the human body. 47 participants had cell phones placed on their left and right ears. One cell phone was activated but muted, the other was turned off. After 50 minutes, the researchers took PET scans of the subjects. Look at what they found. The image on the left shows what happened when the cell phone was turned on. The most active areas are in red. Notice the upper right part of the brain. That's the area closest to the antenna. Compare that with this image on the right of the same subject when they had their cell phones turned off.
A committee composed of scientists from 14 different countries working for the World Health Organization concluded that exposure to cell phone radiation is a possible carcinogen because what the cell phones do is emit a radio frequency magnetic field which interacts with your own biological signaling system to cause this increase. And this expert World Health Scientific Committee found that there was a 40% increased risk of cancer.
It's interesting because you look at all the studies out there and most people will say, look, I mean, they're fine. A lot of scientists will say that. But, you know, I've read all these studies, Larry. I mean, I've spent the last year sort of really reading this, and there's 16 really good studies out there, a few since 2000. Most of them, if you really dissect it down, they really only follow the patients along for just a few years. And, you know, people use their cell phones for years and years, and kids start using them. They're going to use them their whole lifetime. Also, some of the studies say regular cell phone use is using it one time a week for 6 months. I mean, who uses a cell phone that little nowadays? So my point is this, that, you know, if you read the studies alone, they'll say they're safe. But if you start to say, well, look, wait a second, how about if it's 10 years? How about it's 20, 30, 40 years?
We don't know yet.
We don't know. And if you use your phone all the time, like you know, people in the news business, they have a cell phone to the ear all the time. Is that really safe?
Many of us can barely remember a time when we didn't have cell phones. In fact, they've become such an integral and common part of our lives that we've ceased to question the technology anymore. One man who has not stopped questioning is Dr. Nick Begich. Best known for his work in the area of HAARP, Dr. Begich has turned his attention to 21st century technologies and the truth behind their interface with the human body and brain. This is an interview not to be missed and one that you'll likely want to share with your family and friends. We're talking about 21st century technologies, and one of the really interesting, I think fascinating technologies that affect most of us now is cell phone technology. And it's my understanding that some of this may actually be affecting us in a negative way.
Yeah, and that's right. You know, cell phones have been one of the few devices that we've had in large circulation where we've actually taken something that produces a radio frequency signal and stuck it right next to the head. And this created quite a bit of controversy. Many will remember years ago there was an incident in Florida where somebody had asserted they had a brain tumor form from cell phone use, and there was a lawsuit filed. The Congress got involved, and this became quite the controversy. And what happened in those congressional hearings, eventually the industry agreed to do a $25 million study where they would look at cell phones and the literature surrounding cell phones and what had already been done in the research, and try and figure out whether indeed there was a biological effect, an effect on our health or on our minds. And so what happened is they hired a guy named Dr. George Carlo, and Dr. Carlo put together a team of experts. The unusual thing was, instead of reporting to, say, an engineering group or something like this with the cell phone industry, his primary contact was their chief lobbyist in Washington, D.C. After 5 years, he had completed his work. He produced a study. The industry went forward with it and said everything is wonderful and everything is safe. And George Carlo was so incensed because he felt that there were significant problems with cell phones, and he published a book called Cell Phones, the Invisible Hazards. And what he showed, and his theoretical model was that the heat transfer from the phone into the head actually caused a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, the things that separate toxins from getting into the brain. And he felt that the most likely mechanism for tumor formation was, in fact, the slowing of the repair of DNA, which normally would take place, but by slowing it down, that's where the tumor formation would occur. And that's what he felt the mechanism was.
But you're saying that the heat transfer was creating a slowing down of the normal DNA repair?
That's correct. And this slowing down is sort of the root of the problem in that particular incident. Now, what he looked at was he looked at children, say at 5 years old, and at 5 years old, 400% more energy actually transfers through the phone through the skull because of skull thickness is much smaller in a 5-year-old than in an adult. A 10-year-old, 200% more energy transfers, and then, of course, the adult transfer. Now, in Great Britain, they take this into consideration. The beginning of the school year, there are warnings that go out that tell parents, if your kids are under 16, dissuade their use from cell phones, because they utilize in Europe what's called the precautionary principle, which says that once you have information that says there may be a problem, you don't wait till there's absolute proof. You begin to give that information to the public so they can utilize that information in making decisions. Now, this applies to areas in health and areas within the environment. And this principle has been applied in Europe about 30 years, and never once have they been wrong. Not waiting for this final proof of the studies like we do in the United States. Now, there's been several other studies beyond George Carlos. There was one study that we actually cite in some of our work that involved 15,000 individuals in Scandinavia. Now, Scandinavia, Finland in particular, Nokia was was sort of the beginning of this whole industry, and so the density of the population that use cell phones is quite high, and there's some history, there's some time that we can actually take a look over a period of time. Now, what that study said is essentially an hour of use, which is per day, which is pretty standard, when you think about how people use these things all over the world now, was sufficient to create a number of effects. One of those effects was heating behind the ears, which most people go, yeah, I feel that. The other was interference with sleep rhythms, interference with short-term memory, interference with sex drive. All these things were being reported, not just the most severe situations of tumor formation, but these other types of incidences. Fatigue was often reported associated with excessive cell phone use. The problem with the device, and you can go back to the work of Professor Lin at the University of Washington back in the 60s, was doing work for the Navy where he was analyzing various energy forms in the microwave range, in the range of cell phones, precisely in the range of cell phones, and looking at physiological effects. And what he found in 5 out of 6 studies, there was actually mutation in the formation of chick embryos because of changes to DNA structures. So when cell phones came out and Dr. Carlos' reports came out, and then the industry said everything is safe, this gentleman came forward and said, wait a minute, we did these studies before cell phones ever existed, and we know that energy densities that are equal to what cell phones produce in those frequency ranges are, in fact, hazardous to a person's long-term health. And so this individual was just one. The other one that came forward was Ross Addy. And Ross Addy, which is A-D-E-Y, if you do a search on the internet, he is one of the most published scientists in the world. He had hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. He was used extensively by the military for looking at all kinds of electromagnetic field effects on human beings. Even Motorola hired him once to look at cell phones. And what he had found is one particular range that cell phones operated within would actually create a beneficial health effect. But the fact that it created any effect then moved this into the realm of the FDA. So the funding was pulled, his project was canceled. Ross Addy also, prior to his death, came forward, and you'll see it on the internet with a good search, and he was incensed by the fact that the industry was dampening what the public was really entitled to know, that there were things that could be done. Now, since Carlos' work came out, there have been over a dozen patents filed by the industry to make cell phones safer.